local, provincial, federal, and international tobacco issues, fulfill speaking and media requests, support calls from those wanting to quit smoking, and increasingly today, tackle queries from those affected by secondhand smoke drifting into their personal space. I can't think of a better person to talk to us about this issue today. Welcome, Veda.
For allowing me to weigh in on what is a highly controversial topic. Love them, hate them. There seems to be very little middle ground with regard to e-cigarettes. So I will give you the facts as I know them and my opinions, of which you might have gathered that I have a few. So the history of tobacco, cigarettes, and us is thousands of years old. But we've really only been aware that they were dangerous in the last 60, 70 years, the 20th century. Cigarettes became the #1 way that people used tobacco for 3 reasons primarily. Up until the end of the 19th century, chew tobacco was pretty common. Now, if you know anybody who chews tobacco or you've seen it, you know that they spit. Coincidentally, tuberculosis had been and was the leading cause of death at the time. Killed about 5 million people a year. People were afraid of getting TB, and if you know somebody who's ever had TB, they also end up with a productive cough and they spit. So, public pressure made chewing tobacco a lot less popular than it had been. And by happy coincidence, a young American named James Bonsack invented the machine that you see on your screen that rolled cigarettes. Could make as many cigarettes in a day as 488 people had been able to do by hand, making cigarettes affordable and available. The other happy coincidence, the advertising industry, just in its infancy at the end of the 19th century. The tobacco industry and the advertising industry realized that if they worked together, the potential for profit was almost unlimited. So they set out to create a demand for the cigarette. Worked very well for all of them. So the facts about tobacco use, it is and remains and will remain the #1 preventable cause of death in the 21st century. If we do nothing about tobacco use, by 2030, the World Health Organization estimates that 10 million people a year will die from tobacco-related disease. What that translates to is about half the people who are alive today who smoke will die because they do. The reason people don't quit, 4 out of 5 people who are addicted to nicotine don't want to be, but they're afraid to quit. They all know somebody who's tried to quit and failed. And that fear of failure keeps a lot of people from trying. It's way too easy just to put stuff off if you think you're going to fail. And a lot of people just forget that nobody gets good at anything without practice. So the unreal expectation that if you decide to quit when you wake up one morning, you'll be done by the end of the day. Not going to happen. It takes time and a lot of practice and hard work to quit smoking. So people have tools for quitting smoking. Hypnosis, acupuncture, nicotine replacement therapy, and possibly the e-cigarette. Fear of relapse is also very real for people who use tobacco, who are addicted to nicotine. And indeed, I think that nicotine probably has the highest rate of relapse of any substance that people abuse. About 75–80% of people will relapse within the first 6 months, most of them within the first 3 days, because we're not good at handling cravings. Our minds are programmed to give in to those cravings, whether it's for ice cream, chocolate, or nicotine, whatever. So there's a problem. Most people who quit and do so successfully take 5 or 6 attempts at giving up nicotine before they can manage to be free lifelong. So we have nicotine delivery devices. Now, from the tobacco industry point of view, the cigarette is ideal. It's self-selected. It's self-administered. It's self-titrated. And best of all, it's legal. What other drug can we think of that's out there that's addictive besides alcohol? That's legal, that addicts people, but so firmly. Most adults in the world probably use alcohol. Few are actually addicted. The reverse is true for cigarettes. About 97 out of 100 people who use tobacco are addicted to nicotine. So it's tough to quit. Nicotine replacement therapies were introduced in the early 1990s. So we have patches, we have gum, we have lozenges, we have the nicotine inhaler, we now have the nicotine spray. Pharmaceutical grade, they meet standards that Health Canada insists on for approval for sale, and they're effective. They approximately double a person's chances of making a successful quit attempt. You can't do it alone. If you're going to quit smoking, you need more than just NRT. It still requires that you do the work to change what you think about tobacco and the behaviors that go along with it. And those behaviors bring us to 2003 in China, where the e-cigarette was invented. It was introduced without a whole lot of fanfare, without a whole lot of interest. No one really thought it would take off. Oh, things have changed. The tobacco industry considered actually an attempt to co-opt nicotine replacement therapies from the pharmaceutical industry, but decided that that was not a battle they wanted to take on. Big pharmacy has almost as much money as big tobacco. So, marketing of tobacco products. The tobacco industry has a long history of what they call product design modification. What it really means, they wanted to be able to counter the fears and the complaints that people had about the product. It turns out that cigarettes irritate your throat. So let's add menthol. It numbs the throat. Nobody will ever know. The smoke was a problem. Let's add a filter tip. Actually, filter tips were introduced because women didn't like to get little bits of tobacco stuck in their teeth and their mouth, but filters really just make it tidy. They don't actually do very much to increase the safety effect. They do reduce the amount of tar that a smoker inhales a little bit, but they also coincidentally increase the amount of carbon monoxide, and that's never good for anybody's heart. So, over the years, they've used a variety of campaigns. Family values, just what every dad wants for his birthday is a carton of cigarettes. Or, sit around with your partner and have them blow smoke in your face. That's really a lot of fun way to spend an evening. Women have been a target a few times over the years. First of all, they targeted suffrage, make women equality. I don't think most women really wanted an equal right to die from tobacco use, but that is what they got. The Marlboro Man is the most successful advertising icon in the history of advertising. It was introduced in 1954, and although the master settlement sort of precluded his use, Marlboro is still the #1 selling cigarette in the world. And then you've got My Gingerbread House, which is just an example of the fairy tale that the tobacco industry tries to feed you. It's an adult choice, adult behavior. You're informed. You can make an informed decision. I don't think anybody ever starts out to be addicted. It's just not in our nature to say, hey, I'd really like to be addicted to that. Why don't I do that? People don't do that. Which brings us to the e-cigarette. Now, at its most basic, the concept is pretty simple. You've got something that looks like a cigarette, so it makes people feel better. Gives them that tactile hand-to-mouth behavior. You've got a battery, an atomizer, and a cartridge that's filled with some sort of liquid. What's in that liquid? Well, that remains to be seen, because although they say there's nicotine, the nicotine comes in varying concentrations. They say that propylene glycol is the main word I'm looking for here, preservative, and it is. But you also have water, alcohol, flavorings, and possibly polyethylene glycol 400, or maybe not. And in Canada, of course, you cannot buy an e-cigarette that contains nicotine. However, a study done in Quebec showed that 5 out of 9 products tested were contaminated with nicotine. We don't know how that happened, but there you go. In Canada, you've got access to the internet, you have access to nicotine cartridges. They come in every flavor you can imagine. They are refillable. They are not refillable. The variety is astounding. There are 466 brands of e-cigarettes available on the market. There were $3 billion worth of sales globally in the year 2013. And the World Health Organization estimates that there will be a 17-fold increase by 2030. The tobacco industry sees the e-cigarette as a threat to their monopoly on dealing nicotine and to their profit margin. And they're very unhappy about that, and as a consequence are investing in the e-cigarette. So the original e-cigarette looks like what the vaping community, because that's what they call themselves, they don't use e-cigarettes, they vape. And they call the traditional cigarette the analog cigarette. I mean, you have to kind of admire them for 21st century language to try and persuade people that these are safe and they're wonderful, the best thing since sliced bread. So what it does, it replicates smoking behavior and makes them feel better because it gives them something to do with their hands. And for a lot of smokers, that's a big deal. They need to have that. So evolution of the e-cigarette has been mostly for convenience. People don't want to have to carry a lot of e-juice with them to refill them. You can have the disposable, single-use, 500 puffs worth and then throw it away. Or you can have a cartomizer. So you just plug in your cartridge. And the cartomizer has the e-liquid container is surrounded by polyfoam. So that's what holds the e-liquid. They all have the battery. They all have the heating coil so that this liquid can be vaporized and therefore inhaled. Now, one of the problems here is that although if you use cigarettes and you inhale deeply and fast, you get a bigger hit of nicotine. If you do that same thing with the e-cigarette, what you do is cool off the heating element. So you may get a decreased nicotine delivery as opposed to increasing it. So user behavior is always a factor in how effective these are going to be and how popular they're going to be. The Clearomizer is essentially Cartomizer, except that the cartridge is clear. And I guess it's color-coded so that you can have the flavor of your choice in the color of your choice, just in case you can't read. Now, the problem with being able to read or not turns out to be one for children. Poison centers in 2010, September, got approximately 1 call a month about nicotine poisoning because, you know, on cigarettes, when they're first opened, smell like grapes. And sometimes little kids think that if it smells good, it tastes good. So they might eat cigarettes and find themselves in poison control or in the ER. By February of 2014, the calls to poison control centers were up to 215 a month. And about half of them are children under 5 who think that those flavored e-juices, because they smell good, must taste good. And they will drink them. So the problem with refillable e-cigarettes is just that. They're refillable. So you can buy it in, I don't know, a liter quantity, I suppose, but keep it on a high shelf, keep it out of the reach of your children, under lock and key if you have to. But also be very aware that overdose is not limited to children who cannot read. Nicotine is a poison. So it's absorbed through your skin. If you splash it in your eyes, it causes irritation. And it's nasty. So you have to be careful about how you handle it. 44% of US smokers have tried the e-cigarettes. So I'm guessing the population or the percentage of smokers in Canada that I've tried is about the same. But only about 4% use them on a regular basis. Should go back here. Cartomizers are called Cartos. Clearomizers are called Clearos. And then if you really want, you can get really carried away and buy a kit and build your own and replace the head. Now, it's all about capacity. If you go on the internet and check it out, people are really excited because some of these tanks that you can attach to the atomizers contain up to 6 mils of nicotine. I don't know why that's exciting, but apparently it is. So you can have whatever you want. They come in colors, they come in styles, you name it, it's out there. And you can see them in lots of different places. So, are they economical? Well, they're cheaper than smoking a pack a day, but so is NRT. NRT is designed to be cost-effective for the person who smokes about a pack of cigarettes a day. $10 for one single e-cigarette will get you about 500 puffs. So depending on behavior, how often you puff, how deep your puffs go, maybe it's economical, maybe it's not. A lot of what I'm going to tell you is we don't know. They haven't been out on the market long enough. You know, it took us 50 years of experimentation and anecdotal information, empirical notes from tobacco use, cigarette use, to realize that they were dangerous. So what's happening now is that people who are using the e-cigarette are really the lab rats, the guinea pigs for the e-cigarette industry. We don't know what the long-term effects are going to be, if there are any. But they are cheaper than smoking a pack a day. Are they safe? Okay, maybe. Certainly a third of the people who use e-cigarettes believe that they are absolutely safe. And 40% think that they are a perfectly acceptable alternative to smoking. So of course they're marketed as being something that the person can use where they're not allowed to smoke. So they like to bring them on planes, they like to take them to restaurants, they like to use them in parks, all of the places that we have regulated secondhand tobacco smoke for both those of us who are breathing it in secondhand and for the people who are exposed to it. So propylene glycol, water, alcohol, flavorings, glycerin, and maybe nicotine. So the problem with that is that the content in the e-juice is variable. 466 brands. They can put whatever concentration of nicotine they want. There are no standards. And there are discrepancies between what the label says and what testing shows is actually in the product. Most of the products are produced in China. And unfortunately, that comes with all of the attendant issues that we see with some things that have been manufactured in China and where they've scrimped on materials or substituted materials that have had a deleterious effect on those people who bought the product and used the product, thinking that it was safe. There's no evidence to suggest that they are unsafe, really, not enough. There's just questions. Maybe they are, and maybe they're not. What we do know is that the manufacturers have very little accountability, and there are no standards for production. And the possibility exists that this is an addictive product, but then, you know, so is the cigarette. So who are we to argue? Are they the tool to quit better than anything else that's available? Again, maybe. But there are no shortage of testimonials from people who say that I could not have quit without the e-cigarette. Unfortunately, that translates to a lot of people out there who may become long-term users of the e-cigarette because it replicates an addictive behavior. And if you work with addiction, you know that one of the things you do not do to maintain your abstinence is replicate the behavior that you had as an addict. So this comes with problems, but what studies seem to indicate is that short term, sure, it can be one more tool that people can use to help them quit smoking, but it's certainly not the be-all and end-all, and not to say that there aren't other more efficient ways and healthier ways to quit smoking. They're not a proven cessation aid. Nobody wants to take them off the market to say that, yes, they're dangerous, because they may prove to be useful. But there's no evidence that says they're any better than the pharmaceutical grade NRT that we already have. Why would anybody choose to use an unproven product that doesn't increase your chances when you have a pharmaceutical-grade, evidence-based, proven product, except for the fact that the e-cigarette allows you the hand-to-mouth. But if you're really concerned with hand-to-mouth action, the nicotine inhaler, the most expensive version of NRT, provides that. It just doesn't look quite as much like a cigarette, although it doesn't look any sillier than some of the Cartomizers out there with tanks attached. If you've seen celebrities using those in interviews or wherever, they look dumb. But again, my opinion. And the exposure effects for harm reduction, well, of course, the proponents of e-cigarettes will tell you that, of course, it's harm reduction. And, okay, it seems like it would be. And you've got 4,000 chemicals in tobacco and smoke. And the average person who smokes 15 cigarettes a day inhales that mix of 4,000 chemicals about 150 times a day, every day for 15 or 20 years. This seems like a much safer thing to do. But nicotine has its own issues. It doesn't seem to cause disease. However, it has been implicated in cardiovascular disease because it appears to increase plaque formation inside your blood vessels. It has been proven to be a danger to pregnant women, and there is sufficient evidence that suggests that we should be cautionary about administering nicotine in any form to children, to teens, to pregnant women, to women of reproductive age, because it may have some effect on fetal brain development and childhood brain development. So just, be aware. And of course, there's a danger of overdose. But there's no tar. But that doesn't mean that what you get is safe. It turns out that when you are around e-cigarette vapor, or when you're doing it yourself, it increases the background levels of toxicants and particulate matter. And it's not clear whether or not that translates to reduced exposure. From ultrafine particles, you get eye irritation. What it's proven, or what examination has shown, is that some carcinogens and some toxins are 1 to 2 times magnitude lower than what you find in cigarette smoke, but higher than with the nicotine inhaler. So again, proven versus unproven. And for formaldehyde and acrolein, the levels are as high as they are in secondhand smoke. So chromium causes its own problems. Apparently people who are exposed to chromium, mostly in the butterscotch flavor, and this comes out of the UK, the butterscotch flavor of e-juice can cause BOOP, which is bronchiolitis obliterans, something pneumonia. Can't remember what that is. I should know that from my years as a head nurse, but it's escaped me. Anyways, it's called BOOP, and it's a nasty disease, and nobody really wants it. So clients who are going to consider whether or not they use e-cigarettes or a more traditional method deserve the security of knowing what they're getting, whether it's purity or content or nicotine concentration. They shouldn't have to be lab rats. The risk of exposure to vapor is unknown. There is no safe threshold for particulate exposure. You know that. And what you get is not just water vapor. But that's what the proponents would have you believe. It's just water vapor. So why do people use them? Well, because it simulates smoking, and they like that. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it. No, yes, they are addicted, but they still, the behavior, it's an instant reward. And to have something in your hands, you will notice that I'm playing with paperclip. Had I learned to smoke, I'd have been a very heavy smoker. I love having things to play with. So for the e-cigarette user, that's important, that tactile sensation. And they see it as a trend. They see celebrities using it in interviews. Julia Dreyfus at the Oscars. And they read articles in the media or watch the news and hear people talking about the e-cigarette market. They expect that it will outpace the cigarette. Of course. Then you've got NRT, evidence-based, readily available. In fact, the BC government provides it free for 12 weeks every year if you want to quit smoking. Hard to argue with that. Free versus $10 a day, or whatever the person chooses, however they use it to make it economical for them. It's an issue. The increasing popularity, it's perceived as being safe. It's perceived as being trendy. Youth, the number of never smoked youth who've tried e-cigarettes has doubled in a couple of years. And those teens who've tried e-cigarettes are twice as likely to indicate that they will try a conventional cigarette. So it's a gateway for youth. Secondhand smoke exposure? Well, again, more studies. There's a whole lot of maybes going on here. But anecdotal support for the e-cigarette is huge. We just did our major fundraising event, the Trek for Life and Breath. If you want to cycle 200 kilometers over 2 days, come join us next year. But there was a trekker who, clutching her e-cigarette, was determined that without that e-cigarette, she would not have been able to participate in Trek. Because she wouldn't have been able to breathe well enough as long as she was smoking. Now, she's probably right. There's a killer hill at the end of the first day. And even most of the people who don't smoke don't ride that hill. But it's there. So, and she admits that 2 years after she's quit smoking, she's clutching her e-cigarette as she walks around. I'm happy about it. The concern for the tobacco control community is that it renormalizes smoking behavior. We've worked so hard in the last 60 years to make smoking abnormal, because it's not normal to light stuff on fire and deliberately inhale the smoke into your lungs. Really, it's not. If it weren't for the addictiveness of nicotine, nobody would do it. But because it is addictive, it's with us and not going to go away anytime soon. So what we have are questions and issues. Non-nicotine e-cigarettes are available for sale in Canada because the Federal Food and Drug Act requires that any substance sold in Canada that might make a health claim needs to pass inspection, needs to pass standards, have standards. Since the e-cigarette has no standards, Health Canada will not approve it for sale, which doesn't mean it's not available. You can go down to any smoke shop and buy a rebuildable kit for the e-cigarette. You can go to the internet and buy any flavor of e-cigarette juice that you want and have it delivered to your home. Nobody checks to make sure that you're 19. And nobody would lie on the internet, of course. Internationally, the European Parliament passed recommendations that would ban e-cigarette use from any place where smoking is prohibited, that it not be sold to minors, and that they meet some standards. And the food and what I'm looking for here, the drug FDA, I can't remember what that stands for either, in the States has made similar recommendations in the spring of this year. They're not passed, of course. The U.S. is really good at making recommendations, but not actually signing and doing very much about it. Whoops, there's no pain in the game. So we don't know. We don't know at all what's going to happen. But everybody recognizes that there needs to be regulation. There needs to be standards. Now, as the tobacco industry gets involved, because they don't like threats to their profit margins, what's happened is that Imperial Tobacco, the British tobacco giant, spent $75 million to acquire the intellectual property from the Chinese inventor of the e-cigarette. Altria parent company of Philip Morris, the largest and most profitable tobacco company in the world, spent $110 million to acquire Green Smoke, which I assume to be a Chinese company that makes e-cigarettes. So they are getting involved and producing their own brands out there. Blue, I think, is probably the most popular brand of e-cigarette, and it's produced by Lorillard, which is a subsidiary of Brown & Williamson. R.J. Reynolds has got their own brand. They're all getting out there because they see it as possibly a way to take over the business. They don't like competition either. So they're being involved, and perhaps with the tobacco industry, because they have to meet FDA standards. We may see some standardization and some regulation within. But if you believe that the tobacco industry will regulate itself, we need to go back to my picture of the gingerbread house. It's a fairy tale. And that's really all I can tell you about e-cigarettes. They're here. They're not going away. But whether or not they're safe, I don't know. And I don't think anybody really does. Where the research dollars are going to come from to decide whether or not they're safe, I don't know that either. But perhaps if you're wanting to be a researcher and make a name for yourself, you could study e-cigarettes. Who knows? Do you have any questions?
Thank you very much, Veda. Just a reminder to everybody in the room that you need to have the mic if you're going to ask a question. So I'll ask for your help in handing it around, and we'll wait for some online questions to come in as well.
I noticed something just a few weeks ago, which was a sign in the grocery store where I was shopping that said, "No e-cigarettes." Is that a trend that you're promoting? Have you heard of it other places?
Well, it's up to the individual retailer in British Columbia, but yeah, we're in favor of that. We don't think that they should be allowed anywhere that there are smoke-free spaces, just because it does renormalize. And if you've all got kids or you know kids, they imitate adult behavior. And if they see adults doing it, they'll think it's a good idea. And they just don't have the experience or the judgment to make a better call.
Hello, thank you. Is there any data on the rate of fires caused by cigarettes and whether or not the rise in popularity of e-cigarettes has altered that or not?
Nobody actually keeps statistics on fires related to tobacco use. What we do know is that it is the #1 cause of fires in which people die. But with the advent of the cigarette that must go out, if you leave it unattended, I'm sure that the rate of fires caused by tobacco has gone down. But it's still a factor.
Hi. For smokers, do you know, is rolling tobacco healthier than cigarettes in terms of all the additional chemicals in cigarettes?
Cheaper, yes. Healthier, no. There is no safe way to use tobacco unless you want to keep it as a plant, and it's ugly and requires a lot of care and attention. Other than that, no. Roll your own tobacco. Manufactured cigarettes are quite tightly packed. And I don't think that anybody who rolls their own can pack it quite that tightly. So you get more noxious gases produced when you burn roll your owns than with manufactured cigarettes. And they are taking steps to ensure that roll your own tobacco is not any less expensive than manufactured cigarettes. As I said, they don't like to lose money.
Oh, sorry, Wally, I got here first. I'm seeing these things in the workplace, and there doesn't seem to be sane dialogue around that yet. I'm just wondering if you can comment on it.
Well, I think for the most part, people are stunned by seeing any kind of behavior that resembles smoking, and they don't know quite what to do about it. And because there are no regulations as yet, a number of places are waiting to see. I don't know why everybody wants the regulations first, because the only reason that we have smoke-free spaces in as widespread as we do is because people who quit smoking saw no reason to expose themselves to secondhand smoke and therefore agitated for smoke-free spaces. Whether or not that will translate to an increasing trend, I don't know. But I think that restaurant owners who are responsible for making sure that their premises are smoke-free are asking us for guidance. And certainly they have the right to say, no, you can't use your e-cigarette in here. And I don't think that will change.
Yeah, I don't have any knowledge in addiction, and I don't know anything about nicotine addiction, but I'm just wondering, like, asking your opinion. Do you think, like, if we could somehow get the regulations and relevant authorities decide what goes in those cartridges, maybe just water or whatever they could put in it, do you think the use of e-cigarette would actually help people who want to quit? Like,
again, it's an unqualified maybe. We are hoping that standardization will answer some of those questions. But for the moment, it's too difficult to deal with 466 brands, and the number of the sheer volume of devices available for people to use them, at least with the cigarette. There may be 6 major tobacco companies in the world, but basically if you remove whatever markings that identify them as a particular brand, they're all the same. And we don't have that yet with the e-cigarette, and whether or not we'll get to that point, I don't know.
I have a question. What does the marketing look like for e-cigarettes?
Very much like cigarette marketing looked like in the 50s and 60s.
So there aren't any regulations about it?
Lots of celebrity endorsements. You see advertisements on TV, and there hasn't been a cigarette ad on TV since 1970. So, and what they're really doing is just recycling those old ads from the tobacco companies and substituting the e-cigarette product. And, the movies. The media is huge in promoting the use of e-cigarettes.
Hi, you said that the tobacco industry started, everyone started becoming aware of the health hazards for cigarettes about 60 years ago. I'm just wondering when they start to standardize their products, because if e-cigarettes have been around since 2003, are we at least coming towards the same sort of timeline where they might start standardizing them?
Well, the history of tobacco use. American Tobacco, which was the first company that manufactured cigarettes in large quantity, with the machine. At the turn of the century, American Tobacco controlled about 90% of the industry. So that was pretty standard. And everybody else just kind of copied and went with it, because they were pretty similar to the cigarettes that people rolled for themselves, even when they were manufactured by hand. There weren't that many companies out there. And there still aren't that many companies out there today. And what they're doing is falling all over themselves to have access to primarily the Asian market, because China smokes more cigarettes than anywhere else in the world, and has more smokers than North America has people. So they're not going away.
Just a question in relation to the marketing aspect. So with the regular nicotine cigarettes, according to the regulation, you have to keep them covered in the grocery stores. You can only use a certain size to advertise them and stuff like that. Is that at all applicable to the e-cigarettes as well?
Not at the moment, but the FCTC, which, why do these things just go out of my mind? That's it. It's the first World Health Treaty, and they recommend that e-cigarettes be treated like a tobacco product. So no sales to minors, keep them out of sight, out of mind, and no smoking in where tobacco use is prohibited.
Is it part of the tobacco regulation?
It's not at the moment. And again, I mean, the FTCC is a wonderful treaty, and almost every country in the world has signed on to the treaty, but they haven't all put it into force. The U.S. being one of the major culprits, Germany, another major hotbed for smokers, also has signed the treaty but not put it into force.
Right, we have a pretty interesting online question here. Do you see the potential for e-cigarettes to expand to cannabis and THC addiction?
Possibly, but until they can meet the standards required by our Federal Food and Drug Act, they will not be available in Canada. But that doesn't stop people from selling them. It's an odd sort of fine line between will they arrest you for it? No. But is it legal? No.
I'm just wondering if there's different trends in North America as compared to Europe and Asia, where there's a greater social acceptance of smoking, whether it's like, you know, in restaurants or in the workplace, in terms of smokers that might be converting to moving to e-cigarettes.
Well, it really depends on the jurisdiction. Australia, for instance, has totally banned them. They're not for sale anywhere, whether or not they contain nicotine. You can't find the e-cigarette in Australia. They were also the first country to go with plain brown packaging for cigarettes. And, you know, Canada has advocated that for at least a decade, but it's not here yet. The tobacco industry has so much money and is so willing to spend it to continue their profit margins that it's very difficult. I mean, every time we pat ourselves on the back for what we think is a major step forward in tobacco control, if you do a little further investigation, you find out that the tobacco industry is a couple of steps ahead. They're prepared for that, and they've got a counter for it. If there's a loophole to be found, they'll find it. So the trend in Europe, it's the European Parliament that passed the first recommendations. And there's some concern, for sure, but I think the trend is probably about the same.
You mentioned earlier that youth who had tried e-cigarettes were twice as likely to eventually try regular cigarettes. Is there a real risk that all the steps we've taken to reduce cigarette smoking here in Canada, North America, and across the world, that it may just ramp right back up again?
That's the concern, but there's not a whole lot of evidence to support that one way or the other. But I think the concern is real. Kids like flavored cigarettes. If kids weren't interested in using flavored cigarettes, I don't think they'd be available for adults. Adults, you know, they're addicted to nicotine. They have no taste buds anyways. What do they care what the flavor is? But for kids, and you have to understand that tobacco industry is an industry that needs new customers like no other, because it has to replace the people who quit. It has to replace the people who die. So in their literature, they refer to youth as replacement smokers.
Just share a bit of history. See, I was part of the campaign to get tobacco out of workplaces back in the 80s and 90s. I guess maybe going back to the 70s. And the tobacco industry had this huge, very well organized campaign to protect their market of people smoking in restaurants and bars and so forth. It was really very impressive. They had most restaurant and bar owners convinced in the 1980s and 90s that banning smoking would put them out of business in a week. And so there was huge lobbying, and even up to the year 2000.
Yeah, even up to 2008.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, they were lobbying governments big time. Well, anyway, spending a huge amount of money to convince governments that banning smoking in restaurants and bars was going to be a total disaster. And I had the very interesting job back in the late 90s of interviewing the owner of a couple of Tim Hortons about their efforts to create totally separated smoking areas in some Tim Hortons stores. And they'd actually experimented with going smoke-free in a couple of Tim Hortons. and found that it greatly increased profits to go
Sure does.
completely smoke-free. And that, the separate smoking room that was isolated, separately ventilated, brought with it some serious maintenance costs. And in the restaurant I visited, you could see the ceiling in the smoking area was brown, and the ceiling in the other area was white. And they had both been white a few months before, right?
Yep.
But yeah, don't underestimate the big tobacco companies. And if they are buying up all the little manufacturers of e-cigarettes, they will use means that we can't even imagine today to promote and distribute those e-cigarettes and make money off them.
Oh, absolutely.
And but another question came to mind from your presentation about the accidental poisoning with the e-cigarette juice. That, I think, is maybe a promising issue to counter the arguments that this stuff is safe.
I agree.
That if the manufacturers and distributors of this don't manage to bring that accidental poisoning rate under control, I really think that needs to be emphasized to the public.
Yeah. I mean, very few smokers, as a rule, ever think of nicotine as poison. But it is. It is. It's a wonderful insecticide. That's why it has to be kept under lock and key. You have to have a special license to use nicotine if you're a gardener. But if you're a smoker, it's available at the drugstore.
I've got a question of personal interest. My mother was a flight attendant, and I very clearly remember her coming home when I was young, reeking of cigarette smoke. Are people using these on airplanes, and how are airlines dealing with it? Do you know?
As far as I know, people who've used them on airlines have not been censored, like the people who are stupid enough to light up in the washroom on board an aircraft. But I think they'd like some guidance. And what we know about ultrafine particles, and if there is no safe threshold, I think that probably airlines, at least those airlines that are currently smoke-free, will also ban e-cigarette use.
Are there any airlines in the world that aren't smoke-free?
I believe that Cathay Pacific is not smoke-free. I could be wrong, but there are some. You know.
Okay.
I don't travel enough. I work for a charity.
Any further questions? I think we'll wrap up for today then. Thank you very much, Veda.
Thank you.